I know that this is the last session of today, and we're standing between you and beer and the posters, which are super cool, and the Funding Friday. So I ask of you, we'd love your attention for the next 90 minutes, and then the beer will still be cold when you get there. So welcome again today. My name is Nazila Muradi. For those of you in this room who do not know me, I am a physical scientist at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. And I am pleased to be hosting this session along with Tiffany Vance from the National Ocean Service and who's on Zoom, along with my folks who have been working on this with us from OAR and also from NOS, and Kevin Butler from ESRI. We've been working on this idea of data democratization since I believe 2022, where we were able to be editors on a Frontiers Journal special edition on data democratization. And from it, we got a lot of papers that spanned a lot of different disciplines that touched on different aspects of equality, accessibility, and usability of data, public data, with all different applications and things that I had never seen before. So it offered us an opportunity to consider taking this and taking it to some meetings and trying to figure out, like, in different domains, disciplines, and different industries, what does data democratization mean? It's used by a lot of places. If you type it in, you'll see companies use it. We talk about it in terms of open data and open science, but really, how do we take some of those principles of fair and care and start looking at it in terms of some of the work we do, both within our domains, within our offices, and then again, now thinking a little bit about it in terms of ESIP. So today, again, we have a collaborative notes document. So if you go to the schedule, you'll see a link to that at the top. Please go there and list who you are, because it's an opportunity for us to understand who might have joined this session. Tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and then also if you want to add to the notes, super, I'd love that. Again, I'm going to be facilitating this session. We have Lauren here, and then Tiffany's going to be doing the online. We have a Slido link in our notes that will tell you where to go to ask a question in Slido. Again, remember what our ESIP participation guidelines are. Be kind to each other. And then again, this session is being recorded and archived. So if you thought this was awesome and you have friends who could make it, tell them to go spend some time listening to this again, and then we'll entertain questions. So again, thank you for those of you who are coming to us virtually from Asheville and other places. I appreciate you being here. So today we are going to do a couple of things. Why am I hitting this and it's not moving? Do I have to click on? I got it. Sorry, because we've got two screens here. Is that not, why is it not advancing? Clearly I am not. Are there special buttons?
Just use that
I
one.
did. Oh, this one.
Go this way. It is not moving.
It's not moving.
Maybe the mouse back on this screen, click it and then try it.
Oh my God, you guys.
Yeah. So just click here. Try just click.
Okay, sorry guys.
And now drag the mouse all the way over here.
Oh my goodness. If I told you this is really funny. Okay, so what we're gonna do while Kevin's trying to figure this out is, number one, we are gonna have Kevin from ESRI, Kevin Butler from ESRI who will be giving us sort of an overview of what data democratization is about. Exactly. And then we have Bill Callahan from Synoptic Data also giving us his approach and Synoptic's approach to that, which is, thank you. So again, the 4 or 5 main points, an overview, a little bit, I just gave you what we've learned at some of the different venues, and that's something that Kevin's gonna talk about. Really, that democratization means different things to different people depending on where you are on the data whether you acquire data or you make data accessible. We're going to start thinking a little bit about those ethical considerations. And then again, I'd love for us to leave here with an idea of what our next steps. If we were, ESIP was going to take this on as something we want to champion, what those next steps would be. And then again, because this is a community of practice and a community of people trying to help each other, really understand how we can help each other. So that's the plan for now. And then I'm going to go back. So I'm going to first introduce Kevin Butler. He's our first speaker, and he's going to kind of give us an overview of the work that we've been doing on data democratization. He's a lead product engineer at Esri in Redlands, California, and he has been working a lot on this subject. And please give him your attention. And then after that, we'll hear from Bill Callahan from Synoptic Data, who will also talk about a different approach. So Kevin, can you get, and I think you can get, and I realize I'm so short you can't see me on Zoom. Hi.
The first test is finding the mouse. This needs to go. And the real test is, do we advance? We do. Thanks, Nazi. I'm glad to be here. I haven't been at an ESIP in a couple of years. I promise that this presentation today will be the easiest. There is no rocket science, there are no acronyms, and there are no equations. At the end of the day, right before beer, we thought that we would just take this broad view of data democratization and kind of define it from our perspective. As Nazi indicated, we had the privilege of being guest editors for this special edition of Frontiers, a research topic. And frankly, we were a bit worried that we would get sufficient papers in order to meet the Frontier requirements. We had plenty of papers, and then we did subsequent sessions at AAG and AMS and just had lots of contributions. So I think folks are interested in this topic. And so a quick overview today. Well, data is foundational to all scientific research. I have a pet peeve, being an older person, as new words come into the English language, I often object to the word data scientist. I hope that every scientist is a data scientist. But we can all agree that data is absolutely foundational and has always been pivotal in shaping our analyses and driving discoveries. But traditionally, these data were amassed from direct observations. I taught field research methods for a number of years. I see many field scientists out in this room, but that world is changing. Increasingly, we're getting observations from other locations rather than direct observations. And this is resulting in really an explosion of data. And that explosion is happening for a number of reasons. It's easier to store data. Storage costs are coming down. It's easier to retrieve and share those data. And it's certainly, with the advent of the internet, easier to disseminate those data. So data are at the heart of all environmental science, and increasingly we're getting those data remotely. This is an example from our paper that shows the explosion of data that is out there. I think if you see here, the green line represents the number of active satellites just since 1974 in a cumulative way. The blue line is the number of ocean casts, and look at that scale on the left-hand side. It's in the terms of millions and millions of observations. And then the brown boxes in the middle show the increased granularity of the various climate models that many of us work with. You combine all of these domains together, we're all experiencing the same issues. It's a good issue to have. It's the fact that there's too much data, and it's creating discoverability and usability issues. And the actual role of data itself is changing. I think historically, as I did science, I was writing and creating and producing things for my colleagues, for other scientists, and frankly, other scientists within my specific domain. And certainly that world has changed. We increasingly are doing interdisciplinary work, and we are receiving significant pressure from the government, from civic leaders, from the public to make more data available. So there is internal and external pressure for making data more widely available. And in fact, data is not being seen as the domain of the science community any longer. Data are becoming a public good. It is a beneficial asset that should be available to all people. Well, if it is a public good, just like other infrastructure, our transportation, our police services, local government, then it's an important thing that we need to maintain. We need a system of governance that makes sure that these data are robust and that these data can be shared and that folks can access it in an equitable way. So one method of looking at that, or one viewpoint of looking at how data might be managed, is this idea that we're calling data democratization. And as Nazi said, this term is used in many different contexts. We've chosen this definition, and it is a very democratic definition, we hope. It is the shared and interdependent responsibility of data producers, consumers, and curators to enhance discoverability, accessibility, equity, and the usability of the data. So I hope that the archivists and the data curators in the room can just breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief. The burden isn't completely on you. It is an equal responsibility of those data producers and the data consumers in order to meet these aspirational goals that we'll outline today. So we really see this as a guiding framework. It is not a checklist. It is not a procedure. It is simply a set of aspirational goals that we hope that when you look at it holistically, that I doubt that there'll be anything new here, as many of you care equally as deeply as we do about data, but it's simply putting them all in one place that we're hoping that you can keep this in the back of your mind as you curate, as you produce, and as you consume data. This is not a new concept. We see our work in data democratization as building on FAIR and CARE principles. These were foundational, seminal works that were so valuable, and we don't see our work as replacing that. It is simply building on those and incorporates many of the aspects of FAIR and CARE. And we hope that this concept of data democratization will drive open science. Data is the foundation of science. If we want science to be open, the data is the first step to being open. I'm a visual learner, and I don't think that any presentation is complete without a Venn diagram. And so this encapsulates this idea of data democratization in a single slide. So if you want to snap a picture of this, it'll be in our shared slide deck. I just keep this next to my desk as a reminder of the goals of our project. Well, let's have some definitions quickly. The data producer, this is where the data ecosystem starts, and data production is just happening at tremendous scales. You know, the biosphere, the cryosphere, the atmosphere, environmental data is extending beyond the bounds of our planet even. And so data producers, they generate or create data through collection or measurement or creation of digital content. We'll talk in a few minutes about the way that we see measurement and data and information as being different things. Data producers historically have done in situ measurements. These are still super valuable. We still have whole areas of our Earth that are just desperately undersampled. But increasingly, we're getting in-distance measures, things that are measured remotely. We chose deliberately not to use remotely sensed because the imagery folks kind of own that word these days. And while satellite measurements are so critical, they're no longer the only remote sensed data. I have the privilege of working with lots of customers in the ecology realm, and the number of observations that they're getting with remote tags, with remote cameras is just fantastic. And increasingly, the data that we're using are modeled data. It's in silico, and we're not entering the field at all. We're gathering observations and building models and forecasting into the future. On the data curator side, this is the idea that the curator is a person or an entity, and it really operates at that kind of scale. Individual people all the way up to massive organizations that are responsible for curating data. But the unique takeaway that we would like to bring for the data curator is the fact that this is not only a technical activity. The data curator is at kind of the key pivotal role and serves this idea of socio-technical practice. We collect data for a reason, so that people will use it. If we want people to use the data, then we need to bring in the socio components of that and not just focus specifically on the technical side. The data consumer, this area has just exploded. It's no longer data for the scientist, but it's data for citizens, investigators, policymakers, researchers, stakeholders, anyone that wants to leverage data in order to make decisions. I would argue that the most value that we can bring is not necessarily to the science community, but it's to citizens and policymakers as a whole. They will advance our science for us if we can make them more critical, more informed users of our data. So just a couple more definitions as we go. We see discoverability as being the primary challenge. We have the problem of too much data. And this is the degree to which users that are unaware that the data exists can actually discover it. This is different from findability. So when I lose my car keys, I go and find them because I knew that I had my car keys at one point. It's not the fact that people know which data that they want and they can't go out and find it. I think the basic problem is people are just unaware that particular data sets or a particular environmental variable has even been measured, or that it's been measured multiple times by multiple people. So we're focusing on this idea of discoverability. Accessibility means that we're not putting any unnecessary physical, technical, financial, or language constraints. So accessibility is very different from reachability. You can often reach the data, mean there are no physical or technical barriers. Your servers are up, the portal is there, people can reach that data, but that does not mean that the data is accessible to them. And we'll talk about some examples of that. On the usability side, this means that the data are presented in a format that allows people to use them, to comprehend, to interpret it, and to actually apply it to real world problems. Just because somebody can download the data set, they may not even know the concept of metadata exists. And something important, particularly for this conference, this idea of equity, that fair and unbiased data collection, the curation, and the distribution of it should be the same, no matter who is attempting to use the data. So we talk about this process of democratization. So this really is, it's an evolutionary process. It is not something we're going to start doing tomorrow, and we're going to stop what we're doing today. It is a process or a viewpoint that we hope that we can adopt over a long period of time. And this means simply changing the way that we collect and curate and disseminate data from kind of this non-democratic, centralized, often authoritative, large government agency, large corporation kind of perspective, so that it transforms into this kind of inclusive, participatory framework that makes sure that everyone has a seat at the table. Everyone has a voice in suggesting what we collect, what we curate, and what we share. So the rest of this talk today is going to be focused on challenges and opportunities and suggested practices for reaching these very aspirational goals of data democratization. And we do offer these as suggestions. Not all of these are applicable to all domains. I suspect that many of these things are what you're doing already. We just hope that this will organize your thinking a bit. On the discoverability side, our challenges are volume. We've all seen the big data issues. Data diaspora. Often our data are organized based on the organizational structure of who we work for. And users don't care which division you work for, which DAC you work for. They don't care which division within Esri you work for. They see NOAA, they see NASA, they see Esri. You have the trust. This organizational structure doesn't often mean things to the end user. Our opportunities here are to bridge the gap between science and end users. This is why our government actually spends hundreds of millions of dollars in order to collect data. We need to bridge that gap all the way to the end user. And some of the suggested practices is when we put up data sets, add a data value statement. This data is different from the previous measurements of sea surface temperature because we almost should consider as if we're trying to market the data. Federated portals, I know many of you are attempting this, and location and variable-centric views of the data. We organize data by our organizational structures. My experience has been people know where they want to ask a question about. Redlands, California, or Sub-Saharan Africa. They want location-centric views of data, and they often know which specific variable that they want. I don't want to go and know about a mission or a ship that collected the data. I know that I need sea surface temperature for the Gulf of Mexico. And if we could structure data in that way, I think it would help a bit. And then data citation. This is a responsibility of the end user. We're competing for funding, competing for space on servers. If users would appropriately cite our data, that gives us statements to those that fund us of the value of the data. Looking at accessibility, our challenges again are volume and different purposes for why we're curating that data. It's very different to put something in an archive versus putting something up for day-to-day retrieval. And I would argue that the biggest barrier here is language. I think many of our portals, many of our data sites are very English-centric. The opportunity here is to bridge the gap between the providers and the end users. Probably the number one thing I would say would be clear licensing. Often you have to dig and dig and dig in order to get a data license document for a particular data set. I work for a commercial entity, and we have very strict limits on what we can use. And so if there is no license, it is automatically off the table for me. I cannot convince a corporate lawyer that I'm allowed to use a data set that doesn't have a data agreement with it. I would argue that we need broader license types and for those to be in very plain English. Data chunking, we'll see that some of these data sets are absolutely massive, and most folks don't have 3 or 5 terabytes of data available on their local machine to download that. Subsetting is so critical. So here's a map of available internet speeds. We are privileged in the United States to have very high speed internet. I suspect that's what we're testing against. Look at, Africa, where critical environmental problems going on. Even look at Australia and South America. Just the broadband internet speeds are just not quite as good there. So if you can't chunk data and we require people to download terabytes of data, it's not going to be usable for them. And then plain language summaries. I don't know if you've seen journals recently, but the trend is they have the scientific abstract, and immediately below that is the plain English abstract. I think that's a great practice. And then multilingual data portals if possible. At Esri, we've made a commitment to releasing our software and documentation in multilingual format, 17 different languages we translate into, and that's both the software and the documentation for it. Looking at equity, as we're getting close to the end here, equity is so important. And often we think we don't need, as data scientists, as data curators, to be concerned about equity. Data are data. They speak for themselves. But I would argue that data are not neutral, that they're necessary for scientific and policymaking activities, but they're seen as neutral, but they're not. Someone has made a decision about where to collect, what to collect, where to validate that data. And I think the easiest thing that we can do is simply acknowledge that there are complexities in the things that we're doing and that we will never get it perfect, but we can have aspirational goals. So our opportunity here is a new perspective, kind of looking at data in a different way. And the suggested practice here is to respect local contexts, ownerships, and agency in the data. What a wonderful plenary yesterday morning talking about data stewardship and the CARE principles. An easy thing to do is acknowledge areas that are disputed. This is just a quick and easy map of the areas of our planet where we're probably collecting data, we're reporting or making data accessible in administrative units. Not everyone agrees on what those administrative units are. So simply disclosing which country boundaries that you're using, ISO 2-2 says, I'm using this agreed upon structure, I didn't make these decisions. On the usability side here, again, these are the same challenges that we all face. For usability, we should have the goal of making actionable science. Data are not valuable in and of themselves. Data are valuable because they inform policy and decision. We would hope that we would have science-based policymaking. And in this instance, to have appropriate temporal and spatial scales. If you are that park manager in sub-Saharan Africa and you're looking at a 50-kilometer pixel, you likely have 1 pixel worth of value over the area that you care about the most. And this will not be new to any of you here, I think. So this slide simply points to the idea that we're used to measurement. Data is what we think we work with on a daily basis. I would argue that end users, policymakers are seeking more information. So we talk at Esri a lot about no longer just producing data, but producing environmental information products, where we've actually synthesized some of the, and done some of the initial work to help that data be more usable and interpretable. And now my only very Esri-looking slide, this idea that we're living in a very challenged world at this point. We are impacting our planet on a daily basis. I understand 6 inches of rain here in Asheville in the last week. Our climate has changed and will continue to change. It's having broad impacts throughout ecosystems. We as scientists cannot solve these problems alone. We're going to have to engage the public in order to try to change human behaviors. And I think data are one of the best ways to do that, and getting those data into the hands of citizen scientists and policymakers. And I think with all of your efforts, we can bring about the change that we need to protect our planet. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. And then next, I'd love to bring up Bill Callahan, who's the VP of Federal Sales Federal Programs. He's going to talk a little bit about the work that Synoptic's doing. You want to come up and then after this, so we have a little more. You're gonna hear a little more, and then I'm gonna ask you to please help us talk a little bit more about this. So we'll have 2 really short breakouts, and I know everyone falls asleep at these, so I'm trying to keep them as short as possible, and with some time to report out, and then we'll end in time for you to go get beer. I promise. Thank you. All right, so please give your attention to Bill.
Which is the advance button.
Thank you, Kevin.
It's these 2. Okay, perfect. Awesome. All right, thank you, Nazi. Thank you, Kevin. I should point out that we have, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present here alongside you. It was very good opening statements there. I should say that we've developed our presentations independently. There's going to be some overlap for sure, which I think is actually a good thing, because it shows that we've come at this from different perspectives and ended up in many of the same areas. But I think there's a couple of areas I'm going to drill down in a little bit more deeply than Kevin did, simply because it's just an artifact of where I work and what I do. And Synoptic comes at this from a curator perspective. And so I'm going to, you mentioned the plenary yesterday morning, and Caleb's presentation, which I thought was very good. And in light of that, since I've already been introduced, I do need to give you a little bit of perspective of Synoptic. It's not a commercial by any stretch of the imagination, but I just want you to understand a little bit more about where we come from in solving this issue, or addressing this issue, I should say. Okay, so real quick, I got 20 minutes, 20 slides. I'm gonna stay 1 minute each. I'm gonna rock and roll through this. We're a public benefit corporation. We are a for-profit corporation. We're a PBC, Public Benefit Corporation. Essentially what that means is via our charter, are out to do some public good. And that way we can make decisions for our company with our broader stakeholders in mind, not driven by profit only, although I said we are a for-profit company, but it gives us more latitude in what we do. We're also a B corporation, so transparency, responsibility, being good environmental stewards, et cetera, are things that we have. So I don't have the presentation down here, so I will be looking over here. So just real quick, those are just some specifics about the organization. Timeline of who we are, where we came from. We go back to the University of Utah and a program called Meso West in the mid-90s. If any of you are from the Intermountain West of the United States, you know that there's a large area, big country out there. And observations that were put out there were few and far between, sparse, difficult to access, so on and so forth. So the University of Utah started aggregating that information and pulling it together in one spot. And then Salt Lake was awarded the Salt Lake Olympics. And so that data became very valuable to helping forecast the weather. It was the Winter Olympics, of course, so very weather sensitive. Let's see what else happened. Then in 2004, so 20 years ago, something called the Baltimore water taxi accident occurred. This is in Baltimore. There was a thunderstorm front out in eastern Pennsylvania, gust front ahead of it, hit the Baltimore water harbor, hit the harbor, unforecasted, tipped over a water taxi, killed 5 people, could have been worse if the National Guard was not in the water at the time. And at the time, I worked for a company called Earth Networks, and we had a lot of weather stations out in the area, in the private sector, that were collecting observations, and we had approached the Weather Service about using that information. But the mindset back in those days, and I'm glad to say it's different these days, but the mindset back then wasn't built here, owned and operated. We don't want to know about it. So we had we were not providing our data to the Weather Service at that time. But this accident happened in the Baltimore Water Harbor. A very powerful congresswoman named Barbara Mikulski lives in the Inner Harbor. This happened on her home turf, and the Weather Service, of course, is in that same area. And so she got us working together, put some funding aside to start doing some data comparisons and so on and so forth. The program was called UrbanNet to start because a lot of the data was in urban areas, and it was post 9/11. There was a big need for dense data to support plume dispersion modeling and things like that. So at the same time, National Academy of Sciences publishes a report called the Ground Up Report. It was about the observing infrastructure here in the US. And one of the prime recommendations from it was, hey, there's this growing capability in the non-federal sector. Before the federal government decides to build, own, and operate another system, it should look at what's out there and how it can be accessed and utilized to its maximum extent. So from that report, we got a boost relative to our program. Funding went up. We started approaching a lot of different partners like the University of Oklahoma and the Oklahoma Mesonet. There's a bunch of weather observing networks out there run by state universities. So we approached them about aggregating the data, bringing it together, making it centrally available for the federal government, for the National Weather Service to use in its operations. We rebranded ourselves the National Mesonet Program. That program is ongoing, funded to the $20+ million level at this point. We have about almost 60 different partners and they're in the private sector, they're in the public sector, they are in the academic sector. And so as that program continued to grow and Meso West, so to speak's capability continued to increase, the company was spun off, or the organization was spun off from the University of Utah, became Synoptic. And Synoptic acts today as the primary aggregator, or the only aggregator, I should say, of all of that information that's flowing up. And there's the rest of the timeline, became a PBC corporation, partnered up with Esri, and our data flows have continued to grow ever since. Just real quick, a couple of programs that we work on, the Mesonet program I just described. We also work on the Upper Missouri River Basin program. This is where the Army Corps of Engineers is providing infrastructure and some operating funding for partners to build out their networks for flood control and so on and so forth. We provide data to the Forest Service for all their operations and research requirements. Work with the State Department through NOAA on building out some capabilities in the least developed countries, starting with the Pacific Islands region, using some of the capabilities I'll describe here in just a second. And we're also working with the WMO via NOAA, via the Met Office, to replace the global telecommunications system with this thing called WIS 2.0. It's described right there. Okay, so just real quick, obviously, just give you an example of how this all works relative to the Mesonet program and what Synoptic does. There's the federal backbone, but there's many other observational capacity out there that can be brought to bear. Comes from many different sources. A lot of logos up there of the various partners that we work with, and there's state and local governments, universities, private sector companies, other federal agencies that have been leveraging our capabilities. Again, increasing the amount of observations available, not only here domestically, but also internationally. We apply a quality control to that information. And starting to now kind of get into this discussion of democratization. We do operate a public portal. Anyone can come here and try and discover what kind of observations are out there that they could leverage in whatever reason they want to. We also provide some hosting services. So a lot of networks that are out there, operate on shoestring and bubblegum and spit and so forth. They don't have a lot of access to robust IT capabilities or otherwise. So we will aggregate their data directly down to their logger level, collect that information for them and make it available. And we also provide them access to dashboards. So displaying their data, getting notifications for system issues that they may be having or weather alerts that are going on within their particular network, and giving them access to other nearby networks as well. So that's kind of in a nutshell what Synoptic does and our kind of role in this ecosystem. So from our perspective, obviously we care about a lot of opportunities that are out there relative to Earth observations. Kevin covered much of what I've got here, but to kind of reiterate, a lot of new and emerging and novel observational platforms have been coming out, particularly in the last 20 years, enabled by electronics miniaturization, computing and communications capabilities, and driven by an increasing need for environmental data. Literally every aspect of our, every segment of our economy is affected by weather and climate, safety and security reasons. We work with the Department of Defense for access to these information. And of course, climate adaptation is becoming an increasing threat and requirement. And in doing so, because there's all of these other organizations that are participating, it's not just driven by the federal government and these observing capabilities, new business models are being employed to make this happen. Shared cost models, if federal government builds it, right, they put the money up, they own and operate it, apply all the operating capital that's necessary to keep it going. The private sector does it. They typically do it for a business reason, and then monetize that network over all sorts of different users and constituencies. And that could include the federal government. It could include regular citizens. Just kind of depends. A lot of public-private academic partnerships. We often talk public-private partnerships, but in our ecosystem, the vast majority of our partners are universities, some of them private, some of them public. And of course, the explosion of data with the volumes, varieties, and sources that Kevin enumerated. And of course, these opportunities come with many different challenges. And I just want to focus in on a couple of them. We kind of talked about what is the definition of democratization. I just went off on my own and did some Google searches and so forth. And we often think of, obviously, accessibility. But there are, as Kevin described, usability, understandable considerations, and so forth. So what are the challenges? Obviously, the big volume, the many different formats, standards, interoperability requirements, discovery. I just kind of mentioned one of the things that we do as a company is try to make these data easily discoverable because up until we started aggregating these data into one location, they were out in their silos and people had a hard time getting to them or didn't even know that they existed in the first place. Ownership, and I'm going to drill down on this a little bit more. Kevin mentioned licenses. Well, when you start involving the private sector and even universities who need funding to maintain their capabilities, they own that data, and they can make it open and unrestricted, or they can restrict it. And then obviously the equitability and literacy considerations. So challenges to data ownership. Commercial entities, I mean, you guys can read this. I'm having a hard time seeing it from here. I can't remember what I wrote, but let's see. Commercial entities in all economic sectors have come to the realization, right, that weather and climate and air and so on and so forth have economic impacts, right? So it affects their bottom line. They can do their job more efficiently, effectively if they have access to better weather information. The technology ecosystem, right, has enabled the private sector to get into this more deeply. Private sector is typically more nimble and responsive, recognizes market needs, and can go after that. And often they'll need to deploy additional observational capacity in order to provide an elevated level of service. Government, federal government here, internationally, as well as things like the World Meteorological Organization, their budgets are not increasing at the pace of which they need to provide services. They need to leverage partners in that capability, in delivering that, whether it's academia for advancing research or the private sector for delivering services. And in this case, obtaining observations that are coming from platforms that are being deployed. So 2 years ago, the U.S. GEO, under the, I can't remember the organization there, it works for in the president's office, not the federal coordinator. But anyway, that organization put out a publication that recognizes, commercial data is here to stay. It's continuing to grow, and in fact, may become the dominant source of observational capacity. I mean, we think about it, right? You've got NESDIS, supporting commercial data buys because there's private sector companies putting up satellites, CubeSats, et cetera, for all sorts of observations coming from space. Not just on the Earth, where it's typically a little less expensive to deploy capabilities. It's a lot more expensive to get up into space, and the private sector is doing that. Think about NASA, supporting a commercial space flight and so forth. So there's a proliferation of such capabilities. Redistribution restrictions on commercial data. It's just a fact of life. Private sector commercial company puts out a capability, they need to monetize it. They need to get a return on investment. Now, a lot of organizations look at this differently. I can start with a couple of academic partners that we have. So if, say, take Texas Tech University, operates the West Texas Mesonet. They don't get a lot of funding from the state of Texas, from the Texas government, so they have to sell their data. They make some of it available. They make it available for researchers at no cost, to education at no cost. But when it comes to commercial entities, they monetize it. And they also participate in the National Mesonet program. So some of the funding coming from the National Weather Service goes down to them. Here in North Carolina, NC State runs the North Carolina EcoNet. Up until last year, they had restricted data sets and needed to monetize it. They somehow, I don't know exactly how, but they got some more robust funding from other sources, and now they are making that data openly available. So just a couple examples of how that has all worked out. So some sample solutions. When it comes to, for instance, the National Mesonet program, drawing from that example, when that data is monetized to the federal government, there's all sorts of different tiers that our partners can select for providing that data. They can provide it unrestricted. So now the North Carolina EcoNet can be provided in an unrestricted manner. There's a whole bunch of different tiers that have been identified here. But just to give you an example, so you could also select, a provider could also select providing it restricted, but for research purposes only, okay? Or they can completely restrict it altogether. So if it's sold to the National Weather Service through the National Mesonet program, it's only for the National Weather Service's use. There's some caveats to that. It's provided to the National Weather Service or NOAA in general for its use, and also that data can be exposed to its collaborators. Its collaborators may be researchers that are doing sponsored research on behalf of the federal government. And in our case, Synoptic, we also try, as our public benefit corporation mantra, we've identified education as a constituency that we want to serve to a greater level. So we provide them unfettered access to our data. And then liberal distribution of derivative products. So many times, you take that information, and instead of just redistributing it in its native format, turn it into something else that can be redistributed, so long as typically you can't get at that native data that was used to make it. So there are ways that the data can be democratized and made more broadly available. So this is a topic that I'm less informed about when we get to the whole equity component, and this is just my last couple of slides. So, what is data equity? That was talked about by Kevin. How is it promoted in earth sciences? I just did a little bit of perusing around to find out, for instance, how is this encouraged in the community? And I found this recent document about the data plan for, federal data plan and so forth. And I was actually struck by the fact, and this document I want to say is good 20-some pages or something like that. There's literally one mention of equity, and it's pretty general, and it's research-oriented only. So I kind of looked at that as maybe a bit of a failure on an opportunity to get a little bit more granular on this topic, because as we know, it is very important. So just a couple of other thoughts. I started looking around at other communities beyond our own in terms of how they treat this data equity. This is from an organization. I don't know a lot about this organization, but they more around community health sort of focus. But still, it's data, right? And so what I loved about their is you get in there, you talk about data equity and so on and so forth, and they were very clear about what you can do, and drilled down a little bit into some specific examples of what we can do as a community to ensure better data equity. And much of this, again, Kevin talked about, but community participation, and it was discussed yesterday during the morning plenary, right, relative to indigenous nations and so forth. It's like you need to involve them in the beginning. You need to involve them in the middle, and in the end. You need to make them a material part of your team, and then check in with them afterward to make sure and do follow-up. Accessibility to data, capacity building. By capacity building, meaning providing them with the tools to get at the data. A website might not be sufficient. They might need to be enabled with some sort of computing capacity or otherwise. We get down to, and I want to, maybe a bad way to refer to it, but or disenfranchised communities or lower, I'll leave it at that. Disenfranchised communities don't have the resources and wherewithal, even having computers, to get at some of these stuff. You need to ensure that. I also look at capacity building as, in our area, There are a lot of communities that don't have observational capacity. Maybe they don't have weather stations, they don't have air quality monitoring, et cetera. And we could help by advocating for capacity building, which gets down to my last bullet down there, advocating for policies and regulations that ensure data equity and all of these other things like capacity building, the visualization systems, addressing biases and disparities in the data that may be inherent, as well as ensuring privacy, security, and which includes, I think, data licensing and so forth. So that is it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. So my plan was, before this room became a sauna, that we would have a breakout and we would bring up 2 topics. But given the fact that even I, who am always freezing, am dying in here, and I want you to not do, I don't want anyone to perish, because we've almost made it through. What I'd love to do is have a discussion about 2 of the things that we wanted to bring up. One was maybe spend a little time just maybe answering, if anyone has any questions for either Kevin or Bill and want to just raise your hand and ask them, it'd be great. These guys know a lot, and that you may have been, the commercial data part is fascinating to those of us who work at Nestis. So if you have any questions, to have them address them, that would be great. And then maybe just have a little discussion about, considering what you've heard today, what you think about the idea of data democratization. It's not just a buzzword, it's not a feel-good thing. We really need to really start considering the how it impacts the work that we do and our communities of practice. And then really something that we talk a lot about, we don't really use the word ethics, and ethics is a really loaded word, so really start talking about the ethical nature of the work of the data and making it accessibility and really what that means. So first of all, let's start off by giving these guys a hand again. Sharing their knowledge and their different perspectives. And does anyone have any questions for either one of them? Can you just come? I don't have a microphone I can use, and then thanks. There's there you go. And then just for those of us who are on who are not here in the room, consider yourselves lucky because it's really warm in here. And then just tell everyone else who you are. I don't know.
Hi.
You have to come up and give a presentation, sure.
There you go. And you could do a great job.
I'm sure.
Hi, I'm Ken Casey. I'm from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. And Kevin, in your sort of introductory remarks, you talked about how this would not be a checklist. And as someone who is a data steward and leads a team of data stewards, we love checklists because they're really powerful in helping us do a set of very specific things, and it gives us something to implement tools around. And so, as much as I do love all of the big picture stuff, I actually am very interested in things like checklists and implementations. So I'm wondering, as you've gone around to the different venues and had your data democratization discussions, if some specific implementation steps have sort of surfaced that are things that we can consider. We're building out our new cloud archive system right now, for example. It's a great time to bake in some of these sorts of capabilities.
It's a great question. Checklists can be good for people that are like me and want to cross things off of the list, but often it means I check things off, I've done my job. I'm done, and I don't think we're ever done. And there's always additional communities that we could reach. I guess if we define our targets very clearly up front, but we see these as a set of very aspirational goals that we really will never reach at 100%. a good example that I've seen of kind of this data democratization in practice was actually data charrettes. They took data to local community centers in St. Louis and basically said, what problems are you facing? They, on the spot, went to their archives, got the data, and then saw how people could or could not interpret the data and apply it to that particular problem. And these were folks that relied on the community center for services. Just a wonderful, very grassroots kind of effort.
Thanks. Anyone? And so, can I add to that? So in one of the papers that we had, when we did our special issue in Frontiers, they did go back and one of the groups that NCI had actually worked with, that had talked a little bit about the gathering of the data and going through, and they did also use a checklist to make sure that they had covered a lot of things. So I think in each part of the data lifecycle, we need to consider data democratization, whether we're talking about, is the data format open? Is our metadata clear? Are we clear about the licensing? And each, I guess, person that touches that life cycle needs to make those considerations. I don't know how to implement it in something like a data onboarding, that you would do something like that, other than to make sure that you are checking that the licensing has been taken care of. You've checked that the metadata makes sense and it's understandable by a human. And that might be that we need to consider how we tell people that story and make them aware of what we need, not just from a technological point of view, but from that human-centric kind of view of how people work. And thank you. I hope that helped.
I'm sorry, it's coming through pretty quietly from the microphone.
Okay.
Maybe people answering, if someone like repeated for Zoom, and we can use this one still.
Oh yeah, sure.
Sorry, it's just
Okay,
that
I'll
one's
do
coming
that.
through quietly.
So I'm gonna hand this off to Nori and I'll go up, or to somebody else. Yeah. I'm sorry, Joseph. Joseph, thank you so much.
I went to find the microphone because I had a question to ask.
Okay, sorry. All right.
Licenses, data licenses. CC is not good for everything, so I had a question, about these licensing deals that you have right now. Are they largely bespoke? Are there things that can be used for different circumstances? I led the CARE session earlier today. I'm particularly interested in licenses that work specifically for Indigenous peoples, and ways to sort of deal with FOIAbility is something that I have to think about a lot.
So, and this is Joseph Gum from Europe, where?
Joseph Gum from NSF NCAR, Data Stewardship Coordinator. I'm also a data curator, and I also love checklists.
I don't know if you online heard that, but it's Joseph Gum from, and he is at NSF, and he was concerned about some of the discussion around what he heard about data licensing, especially when it comes to some of the commercial data. I didn't do a very good job summing that up, but so I'm hoping that some of you might have heard that. So Bill, you're gonna take that question. If you want to come up here, thank you.
I will.
Sure, thanks for the question. I would say data licensing at this point relative to the partners that we work with, the commercial data sets that have been created are a bit all over the place. It's not like there's a template that everybody is working from. But I will say, most of the partners that we have worked with have been very flexible relative to looking at, who needs it, what is it for, so tailoring it, to the end user. What's the organization, what's the end use, what do they ultimately want to do with the data, et cetera. I think, from my perspective, engaging education with data liberally is a very positive thing to do. Supporting research is a very positive thing to do, because often research is looking at not necessarily purely validating a data set, but also looking for applications of those data, which then validate the fact that it exists and how it can be used and maybe what its value is, right? So, and I would say, certain constituencies, I would anticipate that most sources of data, originators of the data in the commercial space would look, favorably upon, trying to help. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. We have another question for Bill. It's from the Zoom. I'll come over.
Okay.
Sorry.
This is something they need to consider.
Sorry, everyone. Okay, so we had a question on Zoom for Bill. Is there a point at which commercial data could become free, older data made free and sent to open archives? Licensing changes with time.
Yes. The art of the possible is there. I mean, so what's the first part of that question?
Is there a point at which commercial data could become free?
Well, some commercial data is, to some degree. I guess I've got I'm trying to think of an example of that. Certainly, some of the archived information from some of the partners after a certain period of time is not restricted. And I guess it depends on who it's free for. Education, supporting education, like I just said, can be free for educational purposes in some regards relative to supporting research. I would say most suppliers of data take the approach of, yes, we want to support researchers and we will make our data available to them at no charge, or if in the case of the supplier has to bend over backwards in order to provide that information, either in a certain format, certain way, however it needs to be curated, and they have to do a lot of work for it, then they might request some sort of compensation to cover their costs for doing so. The answer is yes, but with caveats.
Any follow-up to that?
Nothing.
Thank you. Lori, did you want to ask a question? Okay, all right. So are there any more questions for either Bill or, we got a question also. Bruce, thank you.
So I'm Bruce Wilson. I manage one of the NASA Distributed Active Archive Centers. So I think I'll comment. It's a little bit of maybe more of a comment than a question, but following up, because I think the question of commercial involvement is an interesting one with a lot of ripple effects. And I think two of the frameworks that maybe bound that is looking back to the open data access policy for Landsat 15 years ago at this point in time. Now, that was the federal government charging for data as opposed to a commercial entity, but we can look and see the tremendous commercial benefit that came out of making that free and open. And I think the cautionary tale that those of us, particularly those of us who have been librarians at various points in time, have seen with the escalation of journal costs and the rise of open access there. So I think there's a potential to watch this and maybe comment how you might see this cycling back and forth over time.
So the question is how have I seen this evolve or see it going
Or
forward?
how it might evolve. I mean, it's again a little bit from there. How might this evolve in the future?
Yeah. I think competition in certain areas, they're in the private sector. Some of the newer technologies that are coming about and coming available are often I don't want to say early adopters, but folks who have recognized the need, created a technology or capability, deployed it, and might be the only providers at this point. So like any commodity, once others jump into the game, then there becomes competition, then the pricing becomes more favorable and accessible. That's one example. There's probably others.
Yeah, we just got one more. So from Zoom, this question's for Kevin. How can technology support democratizing data?
In many different ways. I think the common practice for finding data is now portals and search engines. Those things are very flexible. So I think web-based technologies where we can provide location-specific searches, click on the spot that I'm interested in and show me all of the data sets that are available for soil moisture at that particular location. I think often that we do not follow the same kind of user interface or usability practices that other folks follow when they build a web page. We personally go through a lot of usability testing with people that speak many different languages, that have different perceptions of color, in order to make those interfaces as widely usable as possible. I'm reading a great book now called Subtract. This is not something we are good at. I think as type A personalities and overachievers, we always think that more is better. And, the simpler the interface, the better. And updating interfaces, and that's getting much easier with technology not requiring code these days.